Chapter 6. Sabine climbed out the window and pulled herself onto the roof. Malek managed to follow her with little trouble, even though he significantly outweighed her. This only elevated her opinion of him. She bit back a smile and motioned for him to follow. If Malek had such skill as a ship captain, it wasn't surprising he'd found smuggling to be profitable. Which direction, she asked when he crouched down beside her. Back toward the docks. But we'll need to head to the surface streets when we get closer. I'm not familiar enough with the city to identify the landmarks from here. She nodded and climbed over a parapet wall onto a lower section of roof. You handle yourself well up here. Do you travel the rooftops often? Only when I'm trying to avoid attention, she admitted, pointing out an area where the roof appeared a bit weaker. It would support her weight, but probably not his. He nodded and moved behind her while she led him across several more buildings and toward the edge of Dax's territory. The city guards patrolled this area, but many of them were in Dax's pocket. She wasn't sure what instructions he'd given regarding her, but it was safe to assume she needed to avoid them. The night we met. Were you trying to draw attention? Was that why you weren't traveling the rooftops? She frowned. No, I was careless that night. Malek arched his brow. Most people wouldn't have admitted that. I'm not most people. I'm learning that, he said quietly. Sabine darted another glance at him. He studied her again with that unnerving intensity of his. She frowned and turned away, determined to focus on their destination. Malek was a mystery she intended to solve, but she had to keep reminding herself to be patient. Moving forward, she leapt over the railing of a low terrace and climbed up to the adjacent rooftop before crossing to the next building. An owl hooted in the distance and she paused at the edge of the roof. Closing her eyes, she inhaled deeply and took the pulse of the night. Everything was quiet, as though even the few stray people wandering the streets were being respectful of the night's silent embrace. The owl was just an owl this time, not a warning. Sabine opened her eyes and waited for Malek to crouch beside her once again. For such a large man, he had the uncanny ability to wrap himself in the shadows and move silently. Her suspicions deepened that he was much more than he pretended. But then again, they all were pretending to some degree. Does this look familiar? She asked softly, reluctant to disturb the night's silence. I believe so, he gestured farther down the street. Is there a butcher's shop down that way? Sabine nodded. The area he referred to was more congested, but she'd have to take the chance on being recognized. Gesturing toward a trellis which had been a common climbing point for her over the years, she said, We can get down to the street from here. Leading the way, she lowered herself using the trellis as a makeshift ladder. She dropped down the rest of the way once she was low enough and brushed off her hands while Malek started his descent. Malek jumped off the trellis, landing lightly on his feet beside her. She started, and he chuckled. You don't have to look so shocked. I may not be accustomed to your rooftop traveling, but while my mischievous little sister was growing up, she often found herself in out-of-the-way places, particularly when she was trying to get out of her studies. I usually had to hunt her down before our parents discovered she was missing. It led me to climbing some rather tall trees and onto a roof a time or two. You have a sister, she murmured, touched he'd taken it upon himself to look out for her. From the way his eyes softened when he spoke of her, it was obvious he held a great deal of affection for his sister. You two are close. He agreed, considering her thoughtfully, and then his lips curved in a smile. Her name is Kaya. It's been a few years since I last saw her, but I imagine she's still getting into quite a bit of trouble. I just hope she's better at getting herself out of it now. He paused for a moment. What about you? Do you have any siblings? A brother. Sabine looked away, not wanting to revisit the shadows of her past. Sometimes it was better not to speak of such things, especially when the night was eager to capture careless words and send them back to those who might be listening. Without waiting for a response or giving him a chance to ask more questions, she headed down the alley and toward the main thoroughfare. Sabine leaned forward, peering down the street. A couple of guards were patrolling farther down the block, but their gait was leisurely and unhurried. Sabine frowned. In a quiet voice she said, Once the guards pass, we can move down the street. Dax has probably paid them off to keep an eye on this area, and I'd rather not be spotted by them. Glancing in the direction she indicated, he nodded and then stepped back into the shadows. She followed him and leaned against the wall. Closing her eyes, she listened for footsteps. Malek didn't say anything else, but she could feel him watching her. Expectation and anticipation hung in the air as they waited. Only a handful of minutes had elapsed before the sound of the guards' approaching footsteps interrupted the silence. "Hey you," a man's voice called from the same direction as the footsteps. "Move along, you can't sleep here on the street." Sabine's eyes flew open, and she grabbed Malek's arm to pull him away. He shook his head, pointing toward a building across the street from where they were hiding. An unconscious man with a bottle in his hand was in a nearby doorway, and the guards had obviously decided to chase him off. Sabine tensed, scanning the dead-end alleyway for a place to hide. If they climbed the trellis again, they'd be spotted. It was too risky to try to use her magic to shroud them from view, but if the guards turned around, they'd be in clear view. It was unlikely the guards would trouble her too much, but Dax would kill Malek if he found out he'd accompanied her. Not even her mark on Malek's wrist would stop him. Yanking off her heavy cloak, she tied it around her waist to cover her weapons and give the appearance she wore a dress. With her hair unbraided and covering her ears, it might be enough for the guards to overlook them. At the very least, they might not recognize her right away and would assume they were two lovers engaging in a quick tryst in the alley. Malek's expression became quizzical, but she ignored him and gripped his shirt tightly. "Kiss me," she whispered urgently, aware they only had seconds to pull off this ruse. "What?" She pulled him toward her just as footsteps rapidly approached. Awareness filled his eyes, and he lowered his head, pressing his lips against hers. She put her arms around his neck, listening for the guards. Malek wrapped his arms around her, drawing her even closer. Focus was critical, but his nearness affected all of her senses. Oh, this was a very bad idea. The taste of his lips and the scent of his skin were heady, threatening to overwhelm her from pure sensation. Despite the danger of the approaching guards, he took his time, tasting and exploring her mouth. Malek did have magic, but she couldn't tell how much because it was tightly controlled and suppressed. She whimpered and softened against his body, unable to resist him. Part of her was tempted to claim she was merely playing a part, but she wanted this. She wanted him. Unlocking his magic wouldn't be difficult, but she wasn't willing to force him into revealing his secrets before he was ready. This kiss was only a hint of what could be between them, and she suspected this brief taste of him was never going to be enough. But the timing wasn't right for either of them. The footsteps faded, indicating their ruse had worked, but she couldn't bring herself to pull away just yet. She nipped at his lower lip and he groaned, his hand sliding under her shirt and brushing against her bare skin. Sabine broke the kiss suddenly. If she continued kissing him, she'd forget why they'd come here tonight. The temptation to trace her power over his skin was overwhelming. Running her hands down Malek's chest, she managed, "I think they're gone." Malek's breathing was as rapid as hers, and she could feel his heart pounding beneath her fingertips. He searched her expression for a long time. "We could pretend the guards are still here." Despite herself, she laughed. "You're very tempting." "That's not a no," he said with a grin, trailing his fingers under the edge of her shirt to brush against her skin in a light caress. She bit her lip, reluctant to pull away. Their attraction to each other was undeniable, but sex was viewed differently amongst other races. Depending on how much humanity was within him, she couldn't risk allowing him to form any attachments. She didn't trust herself enough with him to hold back her power. Magic could be addictive, especially when coupled with intimacy. If that kiss was any indication, he could easily cause her to forget herself, and that could be dangerous for both of them. With a small smile, she said, "No, it's not. But we should keep moving." Malek's eyes filled with something akin to regret before he moved away from her. She missed the warmth of his body almost immediately, but the space between them brought some clarity. With a sigh, Sabine focused on what needed to be done, namely getting to the bottom of who was behind the attack. Chapter 7. Malek crouched down beside Sabine in the alley and studied her profile. Part of him was surprised he'd been able to convince her to allow him to accompany her. Everything about her was fascinating. Each time he got a glimpse of one of her pointed ears hidden underneath her hair, he wanted to trace its graceful slope with his finger. She smelled incredible too, like the forest and moonlight. His reaction to kissing her had also surprised him. He'd been ready to forego years of tutelage and preparation within seconds of having his hands on her. Releasing her had been more difficult than he'd expected. She glanced over at him with cheeks that were still slightly flushed. With her silvery hair loose around her face and sparkling lavender eyes, he couldn't help but stare. She was exquisite. Unfortunately, judging by Dax's earlier reaction, the guild leader also thought so. He was getting some mixed information about their relationship though. She didn't appear quite as enamored with Dax. "It's the building up ahead on the right," he said, slipping into the language of the Fae. It had set her off guard before, and part of him wanted to see how she'd respond again. "Which floor does he live on?" she asked in the same tongue, leaning forward to get a better look. He paused in surprise, her pronunciation making her normally sultry voice even more captivating. At the very least, one of her parents was Fae. Her inflection with those two words was completely natural. She turned to look at him, a small frown on her face. He cleared his throat, trying to focus again on her question. Having her so close made it difficult to form any coherent thoughts. His living quarters take up the entire top floor. She nodded. "I don't see any other guards other than the ones we already passed. Dax probably hasn't moved his people into position yet. We'll need to hurry before that happens." Right, Malek moved forward and away from her, even though all he wanted to do was get her alone. If he had his way, he'd take her back to his ship and spend the next several hours getting lost in her, breathing in her scent and exploring her delectable body. The Fae's ability to charm and seduce was legendary, but he hadn't believed the talent would be so potent in anyone with a shared heritage. He walked up the steps toward Terrence's building and led Sabine inside. There were 3 floors in this building, and it overlooked the ocean. The area was a bit run down compared to the more affluent areas of the city, but the view was spectacular. Malek gripped the rickety banister and started climbing the stairs. Sabine's footsteps behind him were completely silent, so much so that he kept checking to make sure she was following him. They'd closed the door to Terrence's apartment when they left earlier, but Javen hadn't bothered to lock it. Malek opened it to find nothing had changed. The apartment was still in shambles, making it obvious the entire living quarters had been thoroughly searched. Sabine moved into the room and swept her gaze over the furnishings. Books and cushions had been tossed around and papers littered the floor. Her frown deepened, and he followed her into the room, curious to learn what she'd hoped to find. Sabine trailed her fingers over a table, her tactile exploration making him wonder what it would be like to have her hands on him. He'd noticed she'd done the same thing when she'd been in his room earlier. It was an endearing quality, but it might be more than that. Some magic users could read energies through touch. If that was one of Sabine's talents, it could be extraordinarily useful depending on how powerful it was. She crossed the room, stopping at a small bar area. He turned to see what had caught her attention, but it was simply a bottle of a very expensive dwarven ale. Sabine picked it up and studied the hand-drawn label. "Have you tried that?" She nodded and placed the dwarven ale back on the bar. "Yes, it's a bit of out of place here though." Malek studied the rest of the bottles on the bar. Most of them had been opened, and there were a few homegrown liquors. She was right, such a costly brew didn't quite fit in with the rest of the selection. Malek picked up the bottle in question, but it was still sealed. Unusual, but it hadn't been here long. "It's a shame to let this go to waste," he murmured, debating whether to take it with him. Her mouth twitched in a smile. "We can't have that, can we?" He chuckled. "It would be a travesty. What are the chances I can convince you to share a glass with me?" She tilted her head, and the tip of a pointed ear peeked through her hair. "It's not really to my taste." He nodded, unsurprised by her admission. "You prefer fairy wine, right? I happen to have another case of that on my ship. You have my word none of those have been drugged." Sabine arched her brow. "You have me intrigued, Captain. Is it safe to assume Dax acquired the wine from you?" "Indeed, but I can assure you I had no knowledge about what he planned to do," Malek said with a frown. "If he had known, he would have put a stop to it. I picked up a couple of cases from a merchant in Karga after I left the Dwarven city. Dax took one of those cases off my hands." Sabine studied him thoughtfully and took a step toward him, closing the distance between them. "Dwarven ale is difficult to come by too. Did you bring any of that with you?" "Actually yes," Malek admitted, trying to recount how many cases he'd offloaded since he arrived. "I'll have to check my inventory lists, but I know we brought several crates to shore. Dax received one of them, and I believe he handled the distribution of the rest." Sabine reached for the bottle in his hand, her fingers brushing against his. "When was it distributed?" The items were moved to a warehouse the first day we arrived in port. When did you arrive? The night we met. He shook his head, unsure where she was going with her inquiries. We arrived the day before, but Dax wasn't available to meet with us then. My first mate, Levin, made the arrangements to distribute the goods with the dockmaster. He's the one who agreed to coordinate an introduction to meet with Dax so we could secure Akros as a regular trading port. She tapped the cork on the bottle. Could this bottle have come from your supply? It's possible. Why? What are you thinking? Sabine gave a half-hearted shrug and moved away to investigate the rest of the apartment. His eyes narrowed slightly, watching as she moved throughout the room. She disappeared into the bedroom, and Malek followed her. Clothing was strewn around the room, even the mattress had been cut open and searched. A bookshelf was toppled on its side with the contents scattered on the ground. Sabine walked the length of the room, paused at the wall, and then turned back around. Her footsteps were silent, but she almost seemed to be listening for something as she moved toward him. Running her hand along the wall, she paused at a corner and took a step backward. She stared at the wall for several heartbeats before bending down and touching the floorboards. With a frown, he put the bottle on the messy dresser. Did you find something? There's something here, she said, crawling along the floor and pressing down. Her fingers located a knot in the wood, and she pulled up a loose floorboard. Reaching into the dark hole, she withdrew a small book. What is that? She turned the pages and frowned. I'm not sure. May I? He asked, and she offered it to him. It was a small leather-bound book that appeared more like a ledger than a notebook. Symbols, numbers, and seemingly random letters were scribbled inside. The handwriting was atrocious, but he'd seen coded entries like this before. It's a ledger written in code. You know what it means? She moved closer to him. He leaned over to show her the different columns. If he's running a gambling hall, these could be people who owe him money. I believe the first column may represent a date. The next set would be the name of the person, and the last is probably the amount they're up or down. Sabine frowned. Is Riven on that list? It's possible. Figuring out which entry belongs to him might be the key to unlocking the rest of the code. She lifted her gaze and he was taken aback once again. Her eyes were the palest of blues, but in the right light, the lavender deepened. It made her appear even more fae-like. She placed her hand on his arm, and the mark on his arm warmed as though it recognized her. Do you know how to break the code? He paused, wondering whether she would agree to accept his help. She hadn't been willing to accept the kaleidoscope as a gift, much to his disappointment. If he had any hope of convincing her to trust him, he needed to make it clear there was no obligation in return. Otherwise, she'd likely cut him out of her investigation. I enjoy solving these types of puzzles. I've seen enough of these codes that I can probably decipher it, but it'll take some time. She gave him a small smile, drawing his attention back to her mouth. The urge to kiss her again was overwhelming. This woman was going to drive him to the edge of all distraction. Sabine looked up into his eyes. Perhaps you'll share with me what you learn. I'd be happy to keep you updated on my progress, he offered, fully prepared to spend however many hours it would take if he could keep that look in her eyes. Her hand stayed on his arm as she studied the room again. He wasn't in a hurry for her to pull away, so he remained still. I don't think there's anything else here, she said, and closed her eyes for a moment. He could feel the slightest brush of her magic move outward and sweep across the room. The warding medallion on his neck prevented most magic from directly affecting him, but he'd never been more inclined to yank it off so he could experience the full scope of her power. He cleared his throat, forcing himself to bury his desires. You found more in only a handful of minutes than we did when we searched earlier. We wrongly assumed whoever searched this apartment had already found what they were looking for. I'm wondering if you might have better luck at the gambling hall. Sabine pulled her hand away and tucked her hair behind her ear. I might, but not until tomorrow evening. Dax will likely order his people to search the gambling hall and his home more thoroughly if Terrence doesn't show up soon. We should probably leave before they arrive. Malek placed the ledger in his pocket and picked up the bottle of dwarven ale again. Unable to resist touching her, he placed his hand on her back and led her toward the door. She looked up at him but didn't make any move to pull away. He needed to go for a dip in the ocean to cool off after tonight. They headed downstairs together, and she halted right at the door. Leaning into him, she whispered, "We need to see if there's a back exit. I just saw one of Dax's men." Malek frowned and studied the downstairs of the small lobby. There wasn't another exit as far as he could tell. He handed the bottle of ale to Sabine. "Take this and meet me in the alley where we kissed. I'll go distract him for you." She bit her lip again, and he nearly groaned at the sight. The ocean swim might not be enough to distract himself. He leaned in close and whispered, "I won't say no to another kiss for my efforts in keeping your presence hidden." Her mouth curved in an amused smile. "That can be arranged." He grinned, shoved his hands in his pockets, and whistled a tune as he walked out the front door. The possibility of having to deal with an enraged demon had never been more attractive. Malek had the feeling another kiss from Sabine would definitely be worth the cost and so much more. Sabine barely resisted the urge to laugh. Malek was a little too charming. Even if he hadn't suggested it, she wanted to kiss him again to see if the first time had been a fluke. She had the feeling their next kiss would only fuel the flames even hotter. She ducked down as he headed out the door as though he was simply out for a pleasant stroll. Dax's man would probably recognize him and ask him why he was here, but his presence would be easier to explain than hers. He should be safe enough as long as Dax didn't learn Malek was helping her. Making sure to stay within the shadows, she slipped out the door and headed for the alley. Malek joined her only a few minutes later. She offered him the bottle of ale, and he took it with a mock bow. "I'd ask for my kiss now, but it's probably not a good idea to stay here. I'm not sure if Dax's man believed my excuses." She gave him a teasing smile. "Then we'll have to see about settling my debt when we're alone." His eyes sparkled. "You won't hear any complaints from me, shall we?" Sabine tucked her hair behind her ear and led him back toward Dax's territory and the tavern. If Dax or any of his men saw her from this point onward, it wouldn't matter. She might not be able to lie, but it wouldn't be difficult to lead them to assume their meeting was simply a coincidence. Thankfully, she'd managed to get some information from Terrence's home, but it had raised more questions than answers. If Malek managed to decipher that notebook, it might lead her to the person who had hired him. Her only other option was to go through Dax again, but she wasn't inclined to ask him for any favors. "How long have you and Dax known each other?" She frowned. Normally, she wouldn't answer such personal questions, but Malek had earned the right to know some truths. "Several years. I met him when I came to the city." "Where are you from originally?" Sabine shook her head, refusing to answer the question. Even if she trusted him, the truth was too dangerous to share. Our past may shape who we are, but it doesn't define us. "Fair enough," he murmured, keeping pace with her as they walked down the mostly empty streets. It was only an hour or so before dawn. People would be waking up soon. "Some of Dax's men tried to warn me away from you. I was under the impression the two of you were involved." Sabine frowned at him, suddenly wary. "You were asking about me." Malek hesitated, in a manner of speaking. "The night we met, Posgil mentioned Dax tortured and killed the last man who was interested in you. Then, earlier this evening, Javian suggested it would be beneficial to keep my distance from you. He indicated Dax would have an issue with it." She sighed. Some of Dax's men were bigger gossips than the fishwives who gathered at the docks. Javian was usually more discreet, but he probably thought he was protecting Dax and her by warning Malek away. Posgil, on the other hand, was typical of most goblins and relished stirring up trouble. If Posgil wasn't careful, Dax would toss him into Martha's stew pot and eat him for lunch. The goblin was talking about Kristoff, but he wasn't killed because he was interested in me. Dax caught him stealing from him. He's always dealt with traitors harshly. So it's safe to assume I should avoid listening to rumors. Sabine paused and turned to face Malek. "That would be wise, but I'd like to give you another bit of advice too." He arched his brow. "I'm listening." "Don't underestimate Dax. He's smart and ruthless, and not even my mark on your wrist will protect you for long. Tread lightly around him, Malek." Malek's lips twitched into a hint of a smile. "You believe I need protection." She glanced down the street to make sure it was empty before looking up at him. "You claim you've come to Akros to establish a profitable trading route, but no one comes to this city to secure a fortune. Everyone's either searching for something or hoping to forget something. As long as you're claiming anything different, Dax will never trust you." He studied her for a long time. "Why are you here, Sabine?" I'd like to forget, she murmured and lowered her gaze. There were so many things better left forgotten, but her past was reluctant to release her from her chains. Hey, Malek said gently and touched her arm. She lifted her head, somewhat surprised by the genuine remorse in his eyes. I'm sorry if my question upset you. I didn't realize it was a painful subject. Sabine nodded. You may want to be careful asking too many questions in Acros. You have few allies here, and you'll have even less if Dax decides you're trouble. I won't be able to help you if that happens. Reaching out, she touched the mark on Malek's wrist and infused it with more of her magic. It flared to life briefly before dimming again. Malek wasn't shy about asking her probing questions, and it would be better for both of them if she allowed him to walk away now. Even though it was the smart decision, she couldn't bring herself to part ways with him permanently yet. Gesturing down the street, she said, "Take this street to the end and then turn left. The tavern will be at the end of the road. You should be able to find it without much trouble. I'd take you there myself, but it would be better for me to stay away for now." Malek placed his hand over hers, his touch searing her like a brand. "When can I see you again?" She smiled, unable to hide her pleasure at the question. Before she could respond, he tensed and looked at something over her shoulder. His hand flew to the hilt of his knife, but Sabine took a step toward him. Placing her hand against his chest, she urged, "It's all right. He's a friend." He paused and arched his brow. "Are you sure? I'm not getting particularly friendly vibes." Her smile deepened, and she glanced behind her. Bane was hidden in the shadows, but she knew he was there and waiting for her. It was curious Malek had also sensed his presence, and one more indicator the enigmatic ship captain had magical inclinations. "Yes, but I should go before he gets impatient. I need to tell him about Terrence." Malek frowned. "Very well, but I would like to see you again." She bit her lip, feeling the steady beat of his heart underneath her fingertips. It wasn't smart, but she wanted to see him again too. "A friend of mine is an herbalist with a shop not far from here. I use her workshop to create the poisons I use for my weapons." Esmel. Sabine tilted her head, regarding him with surprise. "You know her?" "We met earlier tonight. She helped create an antidote for Dax." "Ah," she murmured, making a mental note to ask Esmel what she'd thought about Malek. "Her shop is called Witch's Brew. I'll be there in the afternoon if you'd like to meet me." Malek reached down and captured her hand. Raising it, he brushed a soft kiss against it. "Until tomorrow." Charmed by the gesture, she smiled. "May peace walk with you even in your dreams, Malek." Turning away, she headed toward the demon waiting in the shadows. Bane stepped into the light as she approached. He smirked and nodded toward Malek. "New conquest? The kiss on your hand was a nice touch." "Behave," she said, continuing to walk down the street. Bane chuckled and fell into step beside her. "I'm surprised my brother hasn't killed him yet. We both know how Dax feels about competition." She made a non-committal noise. Dax was probably counting down the minutes until she lost interest in Malek. "I've marked him. Dax will leave him alone for now." "Or try to find a way around your mark," Bane muttered with the hint of a growl in his tone, indicating he wasn't pleased she'd marked Malek either. "What do you know about this stranger? And why the hell would you mark him?" She gave him a sharp look. "I'm not discussing him with you." "Very well. I'm assuming you're on your way to Esme's shop. We need to discuss a few other things like the people hunting you." She nodded and continued heading in that direction, more than a little weary. She needed to get some rest before she collapsed. "Yes, but we can talk inside. Dax has people watching the outside of Esme's shop, and I'd rather they not hear what we discuss. If you go around back, I'll lower the wards for you so you can slip over the wall." "That won't be necessary. My men chased Dax's people away from Esme's shop earlier. After I got your message, I assumed you'd be heading here tonight." Bane gestured toward an alley where he had someone standing watch. She didn't recognize the person, but she wasn't as familiar with Bane's people. Sabine blew out a breath and muttered, "Great. More trouble. Dax is going to love that." "I can handle my brother." Bane put his hand on her lower back to lead her toward Esmel's front door. Sabine traced a pattern on the door and infused it with her magic. The warding shimmered with a bluish light before falling away. Witch magic typically flared blue when it was triggered or deactivated. She didn't quite understand why various colors were associated with different types of magic, but most people couldn't see them. They might catch a trace of light or a shimmer in the air, but not much else. Pushing open the door, she led Bane inside the warm and inviting shop. It didn't matter what time she showed up, Esmel always seemed to know when to expect her. The fire had been banked, but it provided enough warmth in the shop to eliminate the worst of the night's chill. Sabine pulled off her cloak and hung it on the hook. Esmel had left a pot of tea on the counter with a note. Sabine picked up the message and smiled at the handwritten script. "Don't argue, just drink the damn tea." It figured. Esmel might be human, but she was also a rather talented witch who enjoyed dabbling in charms and elixirs. Unfortunately, that meant Sabine was frequently volunteered to be a test subject in Esmel's creations. Her friend meant well, but Sabine tried to escape from Esmel's experiments whenever possible. Her magic was much better than her cooking and brewing abilities, which could be quite harrowing at times. Lifting the top of the teapot, Sabine inhaled and then wrinkled her nose at the pungent aroma. Apparently, Esmel was worried about the effects of Dax stealing her magic earlier. In addition to a magical enhancement herb, she also caught a faint whiff of another plant that encouraged relaxation. The two herbs were in direct contrast to each other, not only with their intent but also with their flavors. Sabine motioned for Bane to carry the pot while she picked up a jar of mint and 2 cups. If she had to drink the foul concoction, Bane could suffer too. "I'm not drinking that," Bane said, warily eyeing the 2 cups she'd grabbed. She headed up the stairs toward her room, trusting he'd follow her. "I'm going to add some mint. I've tasted Esme's brews. You don't have enough mint in that little jar to cover up the taste, maybe not even in her entire garden." She grinned and pushed open one of the doors at the top of the stairs. "Don't be a baby. You'll hurt Esme's feelings." "At least I won't be hurling my guts out," Bane muttered, walking into the bedroom Sabine used on occasion. She didn't stay at the shop all the time, but often enough Esmel had offered her a private bedroom. Sabine suspected Esmel would prefer if she moved in permanently, but she wasn't willing to endanger her friend. Too many people might be inclined to hurt Esmel if they knew how much Sabine adored the human witch. That happened once, and she's gotten a lot better. Sabine motioned for him to place the teapot on the dresser. She opened the jar of mint and doctored the tea to mask the worst of the taste. Leaving it to steep, she put her loose hairpins on the dresser, and then sat on the edge of the bed to pull off her boots. Bane wandered over, picked up one of Sabine's hairpins and studied it. "Are you going to tell me why you're not wearing these tonight? You don't normally keep your hair down." "I do when your brother's being a pain in the ass," she muttered and started pulling off the rest of her weapons. He arched his brow. What did Dax do now? "The bastard drugged me." Bane's mouth twitched in a smile, and she glared at him. He chuckled and held up his hands in surrender. "Dax has never been the most tactful. Did you hurt him?" She snorted. "I got to test out a new poison made from sewer rats. Even with Esme's antidote, he's going to be uncomfortable for a few days." Bane laughed. "You're good for him, I'll give you that much. He'll think twice about doing that again." She made a noise of agreement and placed her throwing knives on the small table beside her bed. "He knows I went to see you last night." "Is that so?" Sabine stood and walked back over to the teapot. She poured each of them a cup and then walked over to Bane. Offering it to him, she said, "You need to talk to him, Bane. I'm getting tired of being caught in the middle of your argument. The more time passes, the harder it will be to resolve." Bane took the cup and sniffed it but made no move to drink it. He placed it back on the dresser. "What did you learn about the attack?" She narrowed her eyes at his refusal to discuss Dax. It was tempting to throw one of her poisoned blades at the brother standing in front of her. They needed to fix this mess before she strangled both of them. Perhaps part of their argument was her fault, but she'd made her decision out of necessity. Unlike Dax, Bane had the ability to manipulate someone's life force. He typically used that ability to steal someone's life, making him a very effective assassin. But they'd found his magic could also be used in reverse. It was much more difficult to heal using demonic magic, but they'd found it worked better if he carried her mark and was sworn to protect her. Dax hadn't been pleased when he'd learned about it, and it was still a point of contention between them. The knowledge his brother could live above ground due to her protection mark chafed. If she had known it would cause so many problems between the brothers, she might have reconsidered her decision. Bane didn't seem to have the same controlling tendencies as Dax, which was the main reason she'd agreed in the first place. Although she suspected Bane was simply better at hiding the worst of his demonic traits, may the gods save her from volatile demons and the headaches they created. Irritated by the whole mess, she snapped, "Don't push me tonight, Bane. I'm exhausted and I've had a rough few days. Drink your damn tea, or get the hell out of my room." His amber eyes flashed silver for a second before they faded. He wasn't as quick to temper as Dax, but she'd had it with both of them. She waited, tapping her foot impatiently, and arched her brow at him. He held her gaze and picked up the tea, took a drink, and grimaced. Placing the cup back on the dresser, he crossed his arms over his chest and glared at her, as though daring her to challenge him further. She wouldn't. Someone could only push a demon so far, even one as even-tempered as Bane. Sabine took a sip from her cup and wrinkled her nose. It wasn't horrible, but Bane was right, it was barely palatable. She'd have to talk to Esme again about masking some of the more offensive herbs. Placing her cup on the dresser, she pulled open one of the drawers to find an oversized shirt to wear to sleep. Last week, Dax asked me to reach out to some of my contacts to see if I could get any information for him. He was interested in some strange happenings with the local politicians over the past 2 months. Money has been changing hands, and there's been a heavier presence of armed guards in certain key areas around the city. Bane arched his brow. "I've heard similar complaints from some of my men. It's made moving unseen a bit more difficult. Do you know why?" She hesitated. "Not exactly. I've only begun putting bits and pieces together, but most of this is supposition. Some of Edvar Street kids heard rumors about a cache of ancient artifacts that was recently discovered in one of the catacombs under the city." Bane snorted. "Let me guess, my brother wants to steal them." She smiled and nodded. "Most likely. At the very least, he wants to know what they found. Dax believes they've hired mercenaries to help guard the items, but they keep moving them around. So far, everyone's been tight-lipped about it. His contacts in the city guard don't even know what they're hiding." "How is this related to the attack on you?" Sabine picked up her tea and took another sip. "I contacted Thomas, the owner of a nearby general store, and asked him to arrange a meeting with an informant in the city council's office." Bane frowned. "Thomas? Dax's fence? What does he know about the city council?" She shrugged. "Nothing, but his cousin works as a clerk for the city council. When I stopped at the general store, I didn't realize one of Dax's men was in the back room unloading some merchandise that had arrived by ship. Riven overheard my conversation about the planned meet. He told someone named Terrence where I was going to be. I believe Terrence orchestrated the attack, but I don't know if he was ultimately responsible." Bane scowled. "I've met Terrence. Dax allowed him to set up a gambling hall not far from the docks. If he's the one responsible for this, I'll handle him." Sabine frowned and started unfastening the laces of her shirt. It seemed as though everyone else knew about Terrence, except for her. She'd wanted to put some space between her and Dax, so she'd decided to take a step back from some of Dax's dealings. Now she wondered if that had been a mistake. Terrence is missing, and Dax has people searching for him. How much contact did you have with him? Bane leaned against the wall, watching as she pulled off her shirt. Nudity was common enough amongst her people and his, but Bane had already slipped once the other day by kissing her. She arched her brow at him, and he grinned. "You can't blame me for looking, little one. A beautiful woman should always be admired. But to answer your question, I had very little interaction with Terrence. He hired us to kill someone a few weeks ago, and it's possible that's how he came into contact with one of my men. Nafor was assigned to the task." Sabine frowned and pulled on her nightshirt. Nafor had been the man from the alley with the tattoo, indicating his allegiance to Bane and the Assassin's Guild. Everyone who wore one celebrated the Dark Masters, those gods who were responsible for death, revenge, and chaos. Bane had his own version of the tattoo on one of his arms, and it was an easy way to identify others who followed their credo. "You don't normally talk to me about your assassination contracts." "No, and I'm not giving you details, but in this case you need to know the connection between my people and Terrence." She nodded and reached down to unfasten and slip off her pants. "Do I need to know who the target was?" "Not right now. I'm investigating any connection to you, but I don't believe there is one. It wasn't a difficult target, which was why one of my newer recruits was tasked with killing the mark. Sabine tucked her loose hair behind her ear. There might be another possibility. Your feud with Dax isn't a secret, and most people believe I'm the reason for it. I think it's interesting Terrence hired one of Dax's men for information about me, and then he hired one of your men to kill me. Bane straightened. You believe someone's trying to play us against each other. Walking back over to the bed, she opened the drawer of the nightstand and withdrew the iron dagger she'd collected from Nafor. Even through the leather sheath, the cold iron warmed her skin enough to make it uncomfortable. Direct contact would burn her, not even water would quench the flames. It's a possibility, but he had this. She offered the knife to Bane, and his eyes flashed silver once again. This time they stayed that way for almost a full minute while he tried to get himself under control. She waited, knowing his anger wasn't directed at her, but it wasn't a good idea to push him too far in this state. Dax's temper was explosive and immediate, but Bane's could be much more dangerous when it was fully unleashed. Bane exhaled slowly and gripped the knife. Someone knows who you are. Or suspects, yes, she folded down the blankets in the bed. Many people believe I'm more Fae than human, so this may be a coincidence. It could even have been part of the payment. Iron weapons are rare, even here in a city where the metal can be more easily tolerated. Did you tell Dax about this? She climbed into bed and looked up at Bane. His eyes had returned to normal, but it wouldn't take much to set him off again. Not yet. I planned on telling him tonight before he decided to be an ass. If someone is hoping to take advantage of your disagreement, it's up to both of you to resolve it. Bane's jaw clenched and she sighed. It was too late at night to deal with a brooding overprotective demon. The sun was going to rise soon, and she needed to get some rest before Esmel's clients started showing up. I'm going to bed. Are you staying or leaving? He was quiet for a long time. I'd like to stay for a bit. All right, she said, and listened to him remove some of his weapons. Bane wouldn't fall asleep, but he'd stay with her long enough until she did. Demons didn't love the same way as humans or other magical races, but she knew he cared about her. Bane was worried about what she'd shared, but the real reason he would remain was a little more practical. He simply needed access to her magic. It fueled him enough to enhance his senses and allow him more mobility above ground, but he didn't like being dependent upon it. Any form of intimacy, even small touches and caresses, helped strengthen their connection through the mark on his wrist. It allowed him to go longer periods of time without having direct access to her. Part of the reason Dax wanted Bane to stay away from her was because Dax wanted Bane's mark to fade. Stupid, jealous demons. If Dax would quit trying to control and manipulate every situation involving her, Sabine might consider marking him too. Instead, she was the equivalent of a shiny toy both demons wanted to possess. Bane slid into bed beside her, and she scooted over next to him. He was always so warm, like a giant heater. Wrapping his arm around her, he pulled her closer. I'm putting guards on you around the clock, little one. I have a handful of people who are loyal and beyond reproach. They'll be the ones to watch over you. Resting her head on his chest, she said, just don't get angry when I lose them. You know how I feel about people tracking me. Bane ran his hand down her back and murmured, fair enough. Will you tell me about the man from earlier? Sabine yawned. His name's Malek. And no, you're not allowed to kill him either. I wouldn't ask permission, he said with a chuckle and kissed her hair. If you won't tell me anything more, go to sleep. You didn't tell me what else you learned, she grumbled, closing her eyes and burrowing deeper against his side. Nothing much. It'll keep. We'll talk more after you've had a chance to rest. All right, she whispered, thinking back to the events that happened earlier. Something still troubled her, and she wouldn't be able to sleep until she got an answer. She opened her eyes again. Where did you get the dwarven ale you were drinking the other night? He arched his brow. The one you barely touched. When she nodded, he frowned. I'll have to check with Evo. He managed to acquire a case from a smuggler. Was it a full case? Bane frowned. I'm not sure. Why? I went to Terrence's home earlier tonight. He had a bottle of the same ale. Malek mentioned it was rare and took the bottle with him. I'm wondering if it came from the same case. Bane narrowed his eyes. You need to tell me more about this Malek. If he had a hand in this. I don't believe he's responsible for the attack, she interrupted, refusing to let him continue with that line of thought. If Malek had meant her any harm, she wouldn't have been able to mark him with protective magic. The mark wasn't working quite right, but she should have been able to sense malicious intent. That was part of the reason she'd done it, but she didn't intend to admit that to either Bane or Dax. They had a habit of killing off any perceived threats, regardless of whether they were real or not. Sending a calming wave of her power over Bane, she continued, "Malek's a smuggler. That's how Dax managed to drug me earlier. He used a bottle of fairy wine from Malek's supplies. The dwarven ale we found may have originated from the same shipment, but I don't believe Malek had anything to do with the attack." Bane caressed her back, sliding his hand under her shirt to touch her bare skin. "When did he arrive in town?" "The day before the attack," she admitted, cuddling against Bane once more. Dax let him sit at the docks for a full day before granting him an audience. "Of course. Dax always enjoys lording over his subjects," Bane muttered and then sighed. "Get some sleep, little one. I suspect you're going to need it." Chapter 8. A bell chimed in greeting as Malek pushed open the door to Esmel's shop. The magical ward protecting the shop tickled his skin and heated his necklace, but he ignored it, recognizing it was only to prevent anyone from entering who may intend harm. The store was busier than he expected, and a couple of the customers glanced over at him briefly before turning back to the shelves they were browsing. Bottles of liquids and dried herbs lined the shelves on the walls, while plants in various stages of drying were tied to racks overhead. A fire crackled cheerfully in the fireplace, and several candles were placed around the room, providing a cozy atmosphere. An older woman was seated in an overstuffed chair by the fireplace sipping from a steaming cup, a teapot on the table next to her. Rather than the cold and dank atmosphere he'd experienced in some other witches' shops, this entire store felt more like a warm and inviting home. It only elevated his opinion of Esmel. She obviously didn't need the traditional trappings to encourage business. The woman he'd met the day before flitted around the shop, smiling and laughing with customers. Esmel was once again wearing bright and vivid colors, and she smiled as she handed one of her customers a small cloth pouch. "Add a small pinch of this mixture to your bathwater. You'll be feeling better in no time." "Bless you, Esme," the elderly woman said, clutching the bag tightly to her chest. "I thank the gods every day for bringing you to Akros. I don't know what we'd do without you." Esmel beamed a smile at her and walked the old woman to the door. "You know it's always a pleasure to have you visit me, Lenore. But next time I hope it's just because you'd like to share a cup of tea." "Oh, I'll be back soon enough. You couldn't keep me away." Esmel closed the door behind the woman and turned to face Malek. Her eyes twinkled in amusement. "I was told a handsome ship captain might be visiting my garden today." Malek chuckled. "Oh. She gestured toward a door at the back of the shop. "I think you'll find my garden quite fascinating. There are all sorts of lovely flowers and a few poisonous ones. You might want to step lightly." Before he could respond, Esmel swirled away in another wave of color and toward another customer. Malek grinned and headed for the heavy wooden door. This time, when he opened it, there was no sensation of the warding, which led him to believe it also encompassed the garden area. But what he hadn't been expecting was the explosion of colors and scents permeating the air. The garden was a wonder with almost every type of flower and plant imaginable. He paused, unable to do anything but take in the sight of the unusual oasis in the middle of the disreputable city. It reminded him of the gardens from home, especially the one that had been lovingly tended by his grandmother for years until she'd passed away. He'd never thought to see their equal again. Malek took a few steps on the cobblestone path and then halted as a furious buzzing noise rapidly approached. He turned to see a tiny man wearing a pair of overalls flying in his direction. The small pixie wielded a miniature spear and brandished it in his direction. "Halt. State your purpose, stranger." The high-pitched sound of other voices could be heard, and Malek caught sight of several other pixie faces peering at him from the foliage. Making an effort to keep the smile off his face, he held up his hands. "My name is Malek. Sabine's expecting me." "Sabine? You must have the wrong garden. There's no pixie named Sabine here." Begone, the pixie sneered, still waving his weapon threateningly. "Hush." Barley, a tiny female pixie, flew out from underneath a large leaf. Her bright yellow dress put him in mind of one of the flowers gracing the garden. She darted close to him, looking him up and down curiously. "Don't mind Barley. Sabine put him in charge of defending the garden. He takes his job very seriously." I can see that, Malek agreed, both curious and fascinated by the pixies. Pixies were particular about inhabiting certain gardens, choosing their homes with care. They naturally gravitated to areas with a fae presence, and it shouldn't have surprised him to see them in the southern lands. But he hadn't anticipated seeing them in a city garden plot. "I'm Blossom. I'll take you to Sabine." "I'd appreciate that." Malek glanced over at a scowling Barley. The little pixie still hadn't bothered to lower his weapon. "I'm watching you," Barley warned, waving his spear in Malek's direction, and causing a shimmer of pixie dust to flutter to the ground. "Any sudden movements and you'll feel the sharp edge of my thorn." Blossom giggled, a light, merry sound reminiscent of bells. She motioned for Malek to follow her and flew down the path. He kept to the cobblestones laid out as a charming walkway and moved deeper into the garden. Everywhere he looked, more exotic plants and flowers greeted him. The sound of trickling water caught his attention, and he wondered if they had a private spring here too. As he turned a corner, he nearly stopped in his tracks. Sabine knelt a short distance off the cobblestone path in a patch of sunlight as she collected some plants. She hummed a wordless tune as she worked, and he was taken aback at the vaguely familiar melody. Her hair was once again braided, but this time flowers had been woven into the braids instead of poisoned hairpins. For the first time since he'd met her, he had the feeling he was seeing the real Sabine. She looked up as he approached and gave him a warm smile that caused his heart to skip a beat. Brushing the dirt off her hands, she picked up the plants she'd chosen. "You managed to find me." "So I did," he said, forcing his hands to stay by his side to keep from touching her. In the daylight and with the sun caressing her skin, she was even more captivating. It was going to be next to impossible to focus on why he was here. Blossom landed gracefully on Sabine's shoulder and whispered something in her ear. Sabine grinned, her eyes twinkling with amusement. I agree. Perhaps I will." Blossom giggled at Sabine's words, and the little pixie darted off back into the underbrush. Sabine tilted her head. "I need to take these plants to the workshop. Will you walk with me?" Of course, Malek fell into step beside her. "This garden is extraordinary, and not just because of the plants. It's been a long time since I've been around pixies." Sabine glanced up at him. "You've been around pixies before. They used to visit my grandmother in her gardens when she was still alive. They disappeared around the same time she left this world. I didn't connect the two until now." Sabine nodded. "Pixies can go into mourning when they lose a loved one. They search out sources of nature magic, but when it's gone, not even the life in the garden can sustain them when they're grieving. Many times they'll abandon a garden in search of a new source." Malek studied the flowers surrounding them, but he only caught a few flashes of color before the pixies disappeared again. It was impossible to know how many were living in the garden. They appear to be flourishing here. "Esmel's a very talented nature witch." He made a non-committal noise. Esmel might very well be a talented witch, but he suspected Sabine was the real reason the pixies had decided to take up residence here. It wasn't a secret pixies preferred to be around those with fae blood. Sabine led him toward a small wooden structure that was completely open on one side. It offered some protection from the elements, but it had been constructed in such a way to make it blend in with the rest of the gardenscape. A large table had been built directly into one of the walls of the structure. On top were several bottles filled with various liquids and dried herbs. Sabine placed her plants on the table, and Malek caught sight of another pixie darting out from beneath the underbrush. This one wore bright pink, which was the only way he was able to identify it was a different pixie than Blossom. A pink flower in her hands matched her dress. The pixie perched on Sabine's shoulder, placed the flower in one of Sabine's braids, and then giggled as she flew away. Sabine didn't react, which made him think this was a common occurrence. Malek's mouth twitched in a smile. "The flowers in your hair are a nice touch." What? Sabine frowned and patted at her braids. She gave him a sheepish smile. "Be careful, or you'll end up with some too. They like doing sneak attacks." Malek chuckled. "I'll keep an eye out. What did Blossom say to you before she disappeared?" Sabine gave him a mischievous smile. "She said you're extremely handsome, even though you're much too tall for her." Malek arched his brow, determined to thank the little pixie next time he saw her. Oh. She also thinks I should take you as a lover. Malek paused, remembering Sabine's response to Blossom's comment. Damn. He wasn't about to let that go. Perhaps you will. Sabine bit her lower lip as though trying to suppress a laugh. I'm considering it. I think we can do a bit better than that, Malek said with a grin and moved in closer. She looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with humor. Unable to resist her for a moment longer, he lowered his head and kissed her. This time there was no threat of approaching guards and he could take his time. She tasted even better than he remembered, like berries or something else equally sweet. The scent of blooming flowers surrounded him, and when her body softened against his, he wrapped his arms around her and pulled her closer. He swept in, taking control of their kiss, and when she whimpered in response, his thoughts fractured. He wanted this woman with an urgency that defied all logic or rational thought. No one had ever come close to eliciting this same level of response. She ran her hands up his chest and wound her arms around his neck. It only flamed his desire for her even hotter. Lifting her, he placed her on the table and she wrapped her legs around him, drawing him closer. It still wasn't enough. Her magic flowed over his skin, inciting him to respond, but the warding necklace he wore prevented it from happening. Malek nearly yanked it off, but only barely managed to restrain himself. He wanted Sabine in every way imaginable, but it was too risky. If his suspicions about her were correct, she'd never allow him this close again when she learned who he was. The realization was enough to cool some of his ardor and replace it with regret. Malek forced himself to break their kiss, but he couldn't bring himself to release her. He hesitated, desperately wanting to kiss her again. She blinked up at him with passion-filled eyes that were almost his undoing. If he knew she wouldn't run, he'd damn this entire operation for just one night with her. But he suspected one night would never be enough. He reached up to tuck one of her braids behind her pointed ear and trailed his hand downward along her soft skin. She trembled at his touch, and he had the sudden urge to nibble on her ear. Without doubt, she was the most alluring and captivating woman he'd ever met, and he wanted to possess her completely. Even now, he couldn't stop touching her. I think you almost have me convinced, she said with a teasing smile, running her hands under his shirt and up his bare chest. She infused her touch with a hint of magic, and it was enough to fracture his weakening resolve. The thought of having her hands on other parts of his body was one of the most erotic things he'd ever envisioned, and he wasn't going to be able to hold back much longer. Several pixies called out a warning, and a few seconds later footsteps crunched on the cobblestone path toward them. He spun around, slapping his hand to his weapon as Esmel and Javen approached. Javen's eyes narrowed on him, his expression anything but friendly. Damn it. Dax would definitely hear about this, and that would require some tactical adjustments to his plans. Esmel froze and then winced. Sorry, didn't mean to interrupt. Javen has an urgent message from Dax. Sabine hopped off the table. What is it? Javen's jaw clenched, but he walked over to Sabine and held out a scroll. Sabine frowned and took it, unrolling it to read the message. She lifted her head. When does he need this? Before tonight. Sabine frowned and rolled up the parchment. She offered to Javian. I'm not interested. Tell him to find someone else. Javian didn't take the message. Instead, he held out a small engraved box. Will you reconsider? Dax is willing to pay whatever you believe is fair, and he wanted me to offer you a gift. Sabine tilted her head to study the man but made no move to accept the box. Are you asking for my help, Javian, or are you asking me on behalf of Dax? Javian frowned and lowered the box. The gift is from Dax, but I'm asking that you at least consider his request. He paused for a moment and then added quietly, no one else can do what you can in the time allotted. If necessary, Dax will do this without you. But it will greatly increase the risks to everyone involved, including Dax. Malek frowned. He didn't trust Dax, especially after he'd drugged Sabine, but it wasn't his place to intervene. Regardless of what had happened a few minutes earlier between him and Sabine, it didn't erase the history she shared with Dax. Esmel huffed. Come on, Sabine. You know you're probably going to give in anyway. Let's see what sparkly Dax decided to give you this time without waiting for a response. She took the box from Javian and opened it. She wrinkled her nose and muttered, It's pretty, but I like it better when he gives you jewelry. That's because you end up wearing most of it, Sabine retorted and took the box. Curious about the type of gift that would appeal to Sabine, Malek took a step toward her to look inside. His eyes widened. Within the box was a highly stylized silver dagger. The hilt was extremely intricate and embedded with several precious stones. Such a gift had probably cost a small fortune. Oh, Sabine murmured and stared down at it, indecision clearly warring on her face. This is a dwarven dagger, isn't it? Damn him. He knows I can't resist such workmanship. Esmel snickered. You're too easy, Sabine. He's probably had that sitting in his vault waiting until he pissed you off again. Sabine looked up and shrugged, but she didn't dispute Esmel's words. Putting the box on the table, she lit the brazier and burned the message. You can tell Dax I'll do it, but this is going to cost him. And if he pulls another stunt like the other night, it'll be the last time. Javen's shoulders relaxed at her agreement, and he nodded. I understand and I'll let him know. Do you know when you'll have the information? A few hours. I'll come to the tavern once it's done, Sabine said, turning off the brazier. One of the pixies darted into the ashes and proceeded to make tiny, sooty footprints along the table. Another one squealed and dove into the mess, tossing ash into the air like confetti. Sabine scooped up the confetti-throwing pixie and blew the ash off its wings. You know you're not allowed on my table, Acorn. It took days for your wings to heal last time you knocked over one of my jars. Barley swooped in. My apologies, Sabine. I will ensure this young troublemaker will be suitably punished, he scowled at Acorn. Move it, soldier. I'll have you whipped into shape in no time. The young pixie's eyes widened in fear. He threw his little body down on Sabine's palm and begged for forgiveness. Sabine's mouth twitched in a smile. I think herding the caterpillars away from Esme's garden this afternoon should be sufficient. No whipping will be necessary. Barley saluted Sabine. You heard her, soldier. Let's go. I wish they listened to me half as well, Esmel muttered as the pixies flew away. I'm still finding pixie-sized hand and face prints all over my windows. Sabine brushed the ash off her hands. Put out some sugar water or a honey cake. Tell them they need to clean the windows before they can have any. It'll get done in record time. I'll have to try that. Sabine turned toward Malek and gave him an apologetic smile. I'm afraid I need to take care of something. So I gathered, he murmured, wishing he'd had an opportunity to get a look at the message from Dax. Do you need help with anything? Before Sabine could respond, Javen interrupted. Dax would like a word with you, Malek. He sent a message to your ship requesting an audience. I'll be happy to escort you to him. Malek resisted the urge to curse. The last thing he wanted was to deal with Dax, especially when he'd just had Sabine in his arms. He still didn't know what Sabine saw in the demon, nor did he understand the connection between them. If he didn't need to worry about offending the master thief, he'd say to hell with Dax. But until he found what he came for, Malek needed to continue this charade. Esmel cleared her throat and picked up the box containing the silver dagger. I'll take this inside for you, Sabine. You can pick it up whenever you're finished, doing whatever it is you need to do. Come on, Javen, you can wait for Malek in the shop. Javen scowled and shot Malek a warning look before turning and following Esmel. His meaning was clear. He wasn't happy about Malek getting close to Sabine. That was too damn bad. Sabine reached out and brushed her fingertips across the mark on his wrist. It flared to life briefly at the contact and then settled down, but he knew she'd infused more of her magic into it. Even now, it coursed through his body in an erotic wave of heat. Sabine placed her hand on his chest. I'm glad you stopped by, Malek. Maybe we can continue this later. He barely resisted the urge to groan. This woman had managed to get under his skin already. One small touch from her was enough to make him want to pin her against the table again. He lowered his gaze to her mouth, tempted to kiss her again, but he wasn't sure he'd be able to stop. He needed to figure out a way to convince her to trust him, before she learned the truth. It was only a matter of time before he gave up trying to suppress his instincts when it came to her. Reaching up, he caressed her face. You couldn't keep me away. Her mouth curved upward, and she pressed a light kiss against his lips. You should go. Dax gets grumpy when he's kept waiting, but I look forward to seeing you again soon. Sabine watched Malek head back to Esmel's shop and leaned against the table for support. She'd never been so drawn to someone before, and it had thrown her completely off balance. Years of lessons with Dax and Bane had taught her critical skills and self-control, especially when it came to her magic, but she'd finally met someone who challenged that foundation. Balkan, the beastman who'd helped her escape the Fae years ago, was going to be furious if she jeopardized everything. Blossom swooped down and perched on her shoulder. "I knew it. You are going to take him as a lover, aren't you?" "I'm not sure that's a good idea," Sabine admitted, even though she thought Blossom was probably right. If Javen hadn't interrupted them, it might have happened much sooner than she intended. "Did you pick up on any magic from him? I can't quite get a read on him." "He's definitely not fully human, even though he's pretending like you," Blossom said, her wings buzzing close to Sabine's ear. "He was wearing a ward. I couldn't get close enough to find out." Barley tried to. Sabine frowned. "Yeah, I sensed the ward. I think that's the reason my mark is breaking down so quickly. I have to keep refreshing it. I wish I knew why he's holding on to it. I even tried enticing him a little with my magic to get him to lower it, but that didn't work either." Blossom pulled on one of Sabine's braids, most likely adjusting one of the flowers. "He likes you. Maybe he's hiding too. Maybe you are meant to be together like fated lovers from the old days." Sabine sighed. "That doesn't happen anymore, Blossom. We've corrupted too much of the natural magic of this world since the portal closed. It's nothing more than a fairy tale now." Blossom flew off her shoulder and faced Sabine. Putting her hands on her hips, Blossom said, "But you're helping to bring it back. You're returning the balance. Maybe he can help you." Sabine shook her head and pushed away from the table. It was a pretty thought, but it was impossible. If he were full-blooded Fae, she would know it. "Dax has another job for me. I need to get some information for him, so I'll be gone for the rest of the day. I know you're hoping Malek is special, but I want you to stay away from him. No following or spying. It's too risky in the city." The pixie's wings drooped. Sabine automatically held out her hand, allowing Blossom to perch on her palm. Blossom's bottom lip stuck out in a pout, and the pixie crossed her arms over her chest. "He won't catch us." "He's been around pixies before," Sabine reminded her gently. "You're very talented, but it's too dangerous. If it weren't for all of you, this city would have been unbearable for me to live in. I don't want to risk losing you." Blossom wrapped her arms around Sabine's thumb and hugged her. When she finally had to leave Akros, she would miss Blossom and the rest of her family. It was sometimes difficult for pixies to abandon a garden once they'd established roots. Sabine had made it a point to warn them against doing such a thing. This wasn't a permanent spot for them, and they'd only temporarily claimed it. Pixies lived in large family colonies, and at last count this garden had 43 tending it. She knew each one of them by sight, with their own peculiarities and personalities. Blossom had been the first to find her, but it hadn't taken long for other pixies to take up residence. She cared about all of them, but Blossom would always have a special place in her heart. Sabine smiled at the little pixie and sent a wave of her magic over her. Blossom trilled in happiness, and a wave of pixie dust scattered around her. "Will you come back later?" "Probably not. It's not safe to stay at Esme's too many nights in a row. I'll try to visit tomorrow. Will you collect some mint from the garden tonight? Esme's getting a little low." Blossom nodded. "It's a good moon. It should be potent tonight. I'll have some of my sisters help me." A pixie shrieked somewhere deeper in the garden, and several giggles followed. Sabine grinned as Blossom took off in search of the mischief makers. Plucking the flowers out of her hair, she headed for the shop. It was tempting to leave them in, but it didn't exactly fit the image she'd cultivated. The pixies seemed to enjoy braiding her hair, so she usually let them do it while she worked in the garden. They frequently got a little carried away. She pushed open the door of the shop to find Esmel busy helping an older woman, so Sabine simply waved to her before grabbing her cloak and heading out into the sunlight. Night was the preferable time to travel, which allowed her to either gather the shadows to help hide her identity or traverse the rooftops. But she couldn't risk using the thieves' highway in the daylight. The chances of someone seeing her were too great. As she moved through the busy streets, she used glamour to make small changes to her features and mask her appearance. With each step, she darkened her skin, elongated her nose, and added a few wrinkles for good measure. She'd spent too long in Akros and was becoming too recognizable. She was reluctant to leave the small family she'd created here, but it might be safer for all of them if she moved on. The thought filled her with regret, but she wasn't willing to risk endangering any of them if her identity was discovered. The city streets were crowded with merchants hawking their wares and trying to solicit prospective patrons. Sabine ignored them and made her way toward the oldest section of the city, relaxing slightly as the crowd thinned. The remnants of ancient power drifted upward through the cracks in the cobblestones lining the street, a residual effect from the time the gods still walked this world. It was rumored the worshippers of a mated pair, Ethos, the keeper of shadows, and Brymus, mistress of twilight, had originally built Akros. They had long since abandoned the world with the rest of the gods, forced into exile during the Dragon War. The touch of their magic still remained, and it was their lingering power that helped Sabine hide in the city. She approached the abandoned temple that had once been a great place of gathering and community. After the exile of the gods more than 1,000 years earlier, countless sacrifices had been made in an attempt to recall them to this plane of existence. Even now, Sabine could detect the echoes of spilled sacrificial blood as she walked across the cobblestones. She released her modified glamour and surrounded herself with the shadows, using them to ward against the strongest lingering emotions. Even those without much sensitivity to magic could feel the effects, which was why this part of the city was mostly abandoned. It could be unsettling if someone didn't know how to ward against it. Sabine pushed open the creaking gate to the large grassy courtyard of the temple. Ivy and other foliage had begun to reclaim the building, but the magic of this place had prevented it from fully taking it over. That might happen one day, but it wouldn't be for a long time yet. The gods had protected this place well, and most of their magical protections still worked. Turning away from the temple, Sabine headed toward the rear of the building where the burial stones and crypt remained. The burial stones were large obelisks carved with runes. Some were traced with protections, while others detailed the names and feats of those who were buried within the crypts. The language was old, from a time before the humans had come to the city. To her knowledge, no one except the oldest magical races could read the language or access the magic of the stones. This was the greatest source of power within the city, but only if you knew how to properly tap into it. A young boy emerged from behind one of the burial stones, his eyes lighting up at the sight of her. Sabine gave him a warm smile. "Good afternoon, Toby. Any problems today?" He shook his head and grinned, revealing a gap where he'd lost another tooth. Toby had been a fairly recent addition to Edvar's little band of rebels, but he appeared to be thriving. There were too many orphaned or abandoned children in the city. It broke her heart a little, but it was impossible to help them all. Sabine approached one of the largest crypts and traced a pattern on the door, using the surrounding magic to unlock it. She'd originally intended to make this her own private getaway to escape from Dax and Bane when they irritated her, but she'd quickly seen others had more pressing needs. With so much lingering power, she'd been able to teach the human children how to manipulate some of the magical doorways in this area. It offered them a measure of protection and a place where they could live safely without fear. The rune glowed in acknowledgement of the power she offered, and the door slid open with a groan. Stepping into the dark hallway, she formed a light in her hand, one of the earliest magics she'd learned as a child. It was bright enough to chase away the darkest of the shadows, but not enough to eliminate them completely. After all, the shadows were what gave this place its power. They could be used but never destroyed without creating an imbalance. At the bottom of the stairs, Sabine traced another rune onto the wall. A hidden door opened, and she released her summoned light source before stepping inside the old stone building. It was part of the crypt but couldn't be easily accessed if one didn't know the path to walk or the correct combination of runes. Deeper within the building, she heard laughter and other voices. Sabine paused for a moment to listen. It always warmed her heart that these children could still find reasons to smile when life had been so cruel to them. She'd once laughed that way too, but it had been stolen from her a long time ago. It had been years before she'd learned how to smile again, but some semblance of safety had to be achieved before she could embrace those emotions. She still wasn't safe and probably wouldn't ever be, but she'd come to terms with that. She wasn't sure if these children felt the same way, or if they'd released their earlier burdens when they embraced the sanctuary of the crypt. Either way, every time she came here and saw them, her soul lightened. Dax didn't understand why she bothered with these forgotten children, and even Bane had been somewhat perplexed. Esmel, on the other hand, seemed to sympathize with their plight. The witch regularly asked after them and left small sacks filled with children-sized clothing and other items on Sabine's bed for her to take to them. A teenage girl, maybe a dozen years younger than Sabine, stepped out from one of the rooms. Her eyes widened and a broad smile crossed her face. "Hey Sabine, I heard the door and thought Toby might have been coming in." Sabine smiled at Talia. "No, he's still outside. How are you feeling?" "Much better. The tonic you sent over from Esme worked great. Edvar's even sending me on a job tomorrow." The dark-haired girl grinned and tucked one of her braids behind her ear. She'd started trying to wear her hair in a similar style to Sabine's several months ago. One of these days, Sabine might try to bring Talia to visit the Pixies. They'd enjoy meeting her. Sabine nodded. "Good. I'm looking for Edvar. Do you know where he is?" "He was in the dining hall a few minutes ago. Do you want me to let him know you're here?" Sabine shook her head. "That's all right. I'll find him." Ignoring Talia's curious look, Sabine headed down the hallway in the direction of the voices. Talia's surprise wasn't unusual. Sabine didn't interact with most of the residents on a regular basis. They all knew who she was and she'd recruited a few of them. It was better if she kept her distance. The more relationships she developed here, the harder it would be when she finally had to leave. As it was, Edvar and Talia had come to mean a great deal to her. Her departure would affect them the most, but she'd warned them it was inevitable. Sabine entered the dining area, which had previously been empty and abandoned for generations. Edvar and the other children had spent months trying to return it to some semblance of its former glory. They'd done a remarkable job with their limited resources. The walls were stone and the table itself was a heavily carved piece of wood that was ancient in origin. The magic of this place had prevented it from falling in complete disrepair, but the enthusiasm of the children had brought it back to life. Unwilling to interrupt, Sabine leaned against the wall and watched as Edvar doled out tomorrow's assignments to everyone in the dining area. He was older than the children who lived here, and she guessed he was somewhere in his late teens or early 20s. His operation wasn't as large or as profitable as Dax's, but it served as a feeder group to Dax's crew. Sabine once thought Edvar would have wanted to join Dax's crew, but he'd insisted on remaining here instead. That suited her fine. She couldn't afford to be more entwined in this operation than she already was. Between Edvar and Talia, they had everything well in hand. Edvar pushed his dark blonde hair out of his eyes and handed a rolled-up document to a young girl no more than 9 or 10. She gave him a wide smile and darted out of the room. Edvar looked up and met Sabine's gaze. She nodded at him in greeting and his eyes warmed. He walked over to her and she noted he wore some of the clothes she dropped off for him a few weeks earlier. He was almost as tall as Dax now, and his shoulders were almost as broad. Only a faint trace of his former youthfulness remained. She'd met him when she was still fairly new to the city. One of the city guards had been a little too rough, he'd been caught pickpocketing. He'd managed to escape to this part of the city, which was where Sabine had found him, bleeding and on the verge of death. Sabine had taken him to Esmel's shop, and the two of them had nursed Edvar back to health. Once he recovered, she showed him how to navigate the crypts and helped him set up his operation. Talia had been the next to join them, and the other children followed after that. Edvar shoved his hands into his pockets. "We weren't expecting you until later tonight, but I'm glad you're here. That vendor with those cakes you like set up his cart not too far from here. I think Talia's on her way out to pick some up." She smiled, touched by his thoughtfulness. "I just ran into her. If she gets back before I have to leave, I might steal one to take with me." "It's not stealing if she's going out specifically for you," Edvar said with a grin. "Oh, I got your message yesterday. The kids have started looking for Terrence, but they haven't had any luck yet. They're supposed to check in with me again later tonight." "I'm actually here on another matter." She glanced at the younger children. "It would be better to discuss it privately." Of course, Edvar motioned for her to follow him. Edvar's bedroom was down the hallway right next to the room she used when she spent the night. That wasn't often, but she tried to mix up the places she stayed. One of these days, it would be nice to have a more permanent place to call her own. She swept her gaze over the room as Edvar hastily picked up clothes from the floor and tossed them into a corner. "Can I get you a drink?" "Maybe later. Unfortunately, I can't stay for long." Sabine walked over to some papers scattered on the desk and picked up a hand-drawn picture of Talia. The likeness was uncanny. He'd managed to capture Talia's inquisitive nature perfectly. "This is wonderful, Edvar." "Yeah? I thought it came out pretty good, but I need to fix a few more things on it," he said, looking away as though he were embarrassed by the compliment. "I plan to give that to her when it's finished." I'm sure it will be a treasured gift. Sabine put the picture back and caught sight of another one. She arched her brow at him, and Edvar winced. Sorry, I know you don't want me to draw you, but he gave her a sheepish smile and shrugged. I couldn't resist. I can get rid of it if you want. The last was said almost with regret. Sabine didn't answer right way. Instead, she picked up the drawing and studied it. It was very good, a little too good. She was laughing in the image, and Edvar had enhanced her features as though he'd seen through most of her glamour. Artists possessed their own special brand of magic. The thought of destroying something belonging to Edvar filled her with regret. He'd already lost so much, including his family. She couldn't bring herself to take this from him too. With a sigh, she said, I won't ask you to do that, but I can't risk allowing this to fall into the wrong hands. If someone looking for me were to find it, her voice trailed off, and she shook her head. I would never do anything to put you in harm's way, Sabine, Edvar said quietly, and rubbed the back of his neck. It's only a picture. You can tear it up. I needed to draw you. I can't seem to get it quite right though. I've been working on it for weeks. She gave him a small smile. Edvar didn't give himself enough credit. Instead, he'd attempted to reconcile the truth of her appearance with what she presented to the world. I can't bear to see your creations destroyed. I trust you, Edvar. Just don't allow it to leave the crypt. Of course. Whatever you want. Edvar paused and frowned. Do you mind if I show Talia when I'm finished? I won't show anyone else. That's fine. She returned the picture to the desk. In another place, Edvar might have an opportunity to do something great with his artistic talent. She'd once suggested he consider going to one of the northern cities to study art, but Akros was his home. She hadn't pushed. One thing she'd learned over the years was everyone had their own destiny to follow. Turning back to Edvar, she focused on the reason Dax had asked her to come. Do you know Baxter Rassin? The councilman. Sabine nodded. I need a drawing of his house. I've been inside a few times, but I don't have your artistic talent. Sure. Edvar picked up his sketch pad and sat on the edge of his bed. Do you want the exterior or interior? Both. We're running a job there tonight and I need to have a detailed floor plan for Dax and his crew. Edvar frowned and started to sketch. I can do that. I remember the outside of the house well enough. I used to pickpocket not far from there when I was a kid. Feston was working that area until a few days ago. He said there's been some commotion lately, and they've increased security. They're using mercenaries though, not city guards. Do you think it's tied into the stuff they found in the catacombs? Sabine walked over and sat beside Edvar, watching as the image of the house came to life in front of her. His recollection of the building was better than she expected, but Edvar had always had an eye for this sort of thing. Perhaps. It would explain why Dax wants to break in tonight. There's something going on with the city council. They've been making a lot of changes. I'm not sure what it means for everyone living in Akros, but I've been trying to get more information. You may want to give the kids a warning and ask them to lie low for a while. Edvar snorted. No one pays attention to street kids, Sabine, you know that. She nodded. You're right, but it may be worth it to issue a warning. I have another request too. Anything, he murmured, continuing to draw the outside of the house. You should never make such an offer in a place of magic without hearing the terms first, she reminded him gently. When he rolled his eyes at her, Sabine laughed. They both knew she wouldn't take advantage of him, but others might if he gave them the opportunity. There's a ship in the harbor right now called Obsidian Storm. Do you know it? Edvar's brow furrowed. Yeah, smuggler ship. It got here a few days ago. Dax approved the docking and made the arrangements with the dockmaster. Sabine smiled. Edvar had always been well informed. Yes. Can you have one of the children work the dock area for a few days? I'd like to get more information about the crew, especially the captain. He frowned. Sure, but I can handle that for you. You're a little too recognizable now, Edvar, she teased lightly. That's why Dax doesn't go out on jobs much anymore. It's hard to stay in the shadows when everyone knows who you are. Edvar shrugged and ran his finger over the paper, shading the drawing to give the image some depth. He still goes on some jobs, like tonight. If he's asked you for information about the councilman's home and it's surrounded by mercenaries, he won't let you go in alone. Sabine was quiet for a long time. Dax was protective of her, and Edvar tried to emulate the demon's behavior. The biggest difference was, Edvar was protective of all the children living and working for him, while Dax primarily looked out for himself. She was the only exception. When Edvar completed the rough sketch of the exterior, he turned the page and waited for her instructions on the inside. Sabine started to describe what she remembered, but there would be some estimations. Dax hadn't given her enough time for much more than that, and it had been several months since she'd last been inside the councilman's home. There are 2 floors, plus a cellar. I've been in most of the rooms, and it's unlikely they would have changed much since then. Edvar began drawing. I thought you avoided places like this. I usually do, she admitted, pointing out an area that needed to be enlarged. Baxter has one of the largest libraries in the city. He doesn't notice when I borrow a book or two. It's fairly easy to sneak in and out to replace them and grab more. He grinned, his hair dropping down into his eyes. He absently brushed it away and resumed sketching. You're the only person I know who steals books and then returns them. Borrow, she reminded him with a laugh. Although he has some excellent wines in his cellar. Those I don't borrow, but tonight we won't be shopping for books or wine. Dax is hoping for a big score. We'll see if he actually manages to pull this off.